Let's learn towards the end of Parshat Noach with Rashi's commentary. The beginning of the seventh aliyah of the Parsha begins in chapter 11 of Genesis. It's the place where we have the famous story of the Tower of Babel, Migdal Bavel, as it said in the Hebrew. The opening verse of the chapter reads, Vayehi chol haaretz safa hat u'divarim achadim. The entire earth was of one language. Seemingly, there's nothing wrong with having a unifying language. Don't we in our time rely on certain modes of communication to be bridge-making languages so that we can communicate globally, so that we might find, say, solutions to global crises, as we're doing in this very time. But Rashi suggests there's a contrast between the blessing of having this unifying language in the first half of the pasuk. We get the et nachtad, the kind of trope mark that breaks the verse in half. And the end of the verse, which is two words, u'divarim achadim, and of unified words. So what does "and of unified words" at the end of that verse really come to teach us? We already know they were of safar hat at the beginning of the verse. We learned they were able to speak one language. That was, according to Rashi, Lashon HaKodesh. That was, by the way, Hebrew. And they shared this deep connection to the language of creation. But Divarim Achadim, that gets into the nature of the generation that's called the generation of separation, or the generation of dispersal, as the end of the story goes. Because with one language, they schemed against God. With one language, they hatched a plan to take over heaven, or let's say to rid the earth of God's presence, and thus morality. Ba'u ve'etza achat, they came with one plan of action. Va'amru, lo chol hemenu, she'yavor lo et ha'elyonim. God doesn't have a right to choose for himself the upper realms. Na'alei l'rakia, let us go up to heaven. V'nasei mo milchama, and let us wage a war upon that God. In other words, let's create this tower and show everyone that we are the living gods of the universe, the gods of the world, the mighty heroes who are divine. One feature of the Torah as part of Near Eastern literature is that it works hard to rid humanity of the notion that human leaders or human heroes are divine. That argues against all kinds of mythological realities that were already set into place in Middle Eastern literature, Near Eastern, ancient Near Eastern, Middle Eastern literature. So they come and they feel as though they ought to be worshipped, they ought to be respected, they ought to be the rulers, and the God Most High wouldn't be the God Most High any longer if they could build a tower that reached the heavens. Rashi will, in a typical Rashi kind of way, offer us other reads. Now, I think he's doing two things. One, practically, he's opening up the Jewish library to tell you there are many interpretations about what this phrase means, Divarim Achadim, unified words. Secondly, I think Rashi is suggesting that this text sits okay with any of the following meanings that I'm going to share with you. So it might have been that that was the plan they hatched, and it was all about their taking power for themselves and trying to overcome any notion that God is the ruler of the universe. Here's the second suggestion. Davar acher. U'divarim achadim al yichido shel olam. They were words against the unique one of the world. So that in a certain way says the same, but doesn't base itself on this notion of a war, or a rebellion with arms that these folks want to take up, as if it was some mythological battle about to take place between forces from below and those of the heavens, like we hear in other mythos. Here we have, simply put, they were words against God, and thus a challenge to Adonai Elohim, Adonai Eloheinu. And so they tried to spread, whether it was idolatry or worship of nature, they tried to spread other systems. They tried to usurp God's central role as creator and the one to whom all praise is due. And then, interestingly, there's another Devar Acher. It doesn't always happen that there are three suggestions in a Rashi entry within our manuscripts, but here a third comes. With Devarim Achadim, what is this phrase doing here? What does the phrase say? Amru, the people said, Achat le'elef v'shesh ma'ot v'chamishim v'shesh shanim, harakia mitmotet. So they say once in 1,656 years, the firmament collapses, the waters come, raging floods fill the earth. So here they're kind of being calculating meteorologists. And since we are going to face that kind of disaster again, Kashem Shasa Bimei Hamabu, just like happened in the days of the Great Flood, Bo V'naselo Smuchot, let's build supports for the world. Now this third one begets some interesting questions. That seems to be a fantastic and a wonderful and a mindful use of the one language that humanity shares. How to prepare for the next natural disaster. I mean, don't we seek to understand how to respond when an earthquake is going to hit? Wouldn't we love for better seismographic wisdom in order to forecast when an earthquake's coming, when a typhoon will hit, and make a landing, when tidal waves are roaring in? Don't we want to know when those destructive hailstorms will just obliterate the crops? That seems to be a good goal of humanity's. Their hubris, though, is what the Midrash points out. As if they could create foundations themselves for the earth. This is like someone telling you from the emergency management agency, don't worry at all. This is like a builder saying, my house withstands any hurricane. Just build it like this on the coast, on the cliff. This is like us saying that we have complete control over the winds. It was the hubris in saying that they know exactly how to create the supports. They thought of their own engineering skills as meeting the challenge of thwarting the great plans that are set into motion by the creator of the universe, or at least the systems of Olam Ketiv O Noheg, the great natural systems that are at play within our world, that they were overly confident, boastful, and full of, yes, humanly common hubris, but we're ultimately not able to succeed in that mission. And when they were so convinced that they could respond, they did not meet the task, and they could not engineer the solution that was needed. Only God's covenant with Noah would ensure in that generation and into the future that God would not destroy the world entirely again. Now, we hope that's true. Let's ask the question, given our technological know-how and the advancements in our time, since Rashi's, should we be using a more international language of communication to engineer responses to the natural disasters that await us? I think we should answer yes. I think an extra measure of humility ought to be added into the mix, though, of our human reality. Just look around. We thought we could respond so quickly to a pandemic, or that we could keep the hurricanes at bay, or famine and drought. But we've yet to come up with those solutions. Perhaps God does need our partnership in more wonderful ways to respond to the needs of humanity and to keep ourselves safe on the globe. But when we think of ourselves as gods ourselves, and we think we can establish the entire race on the globe, the race of humanity on the globe, after our own image without the help of God, then we are in store for a great lesson. And that generation, so full of hubris, was in store for a lesson, and they were scattered, and so many languages kept them from unifying around the common good. And we're still struggling with that today. How to unify around the common good and use our incredible minds, the gifts of wisdom and potentials for engineering, to respond with humility. Shabbat Shalom.